Hey everybody, welcome back to Elemental Gardens. Today with no intro for the video, or at least no cinematic shots, which is something that hasn't happened in a super long time. So I'm kind of bummed out about that. I definitely should have had something in there. Would have at least made the entry in this video a little bit nicer than just suddenly hearing my voice out of the blue. But to be honest, I made a lot of these videos under tremendous time pressure in an already kind of busy week and doing everything on the fly in one batch, and now I'm going through all of the commentaries day by day in one batch as well, so it's not really my usual kind of production schedule. It's much tighter than what I normally do, so I hope you'll excuse me for being a little bit messy in this. I'm actually very glad that I've been able to finish this schedule and keep it on schedule and finish this thing on time. But anyway, what are we doing today? I'll be working on one part of the Mainstreet, or I guess actually the majority of the Mainstreet, finishing this one building on this side so that we can move over to the other side, get all the buildings in there, and that basically means that the Mainstreet is going to be finished after this episode. Also, I'll be working on a small, well, sort of small, a pretty large actually, entrance plaza that you'll come into after the Mainstreet, because there was still an open area between the Mainstreet and the observation tower, and I originally thought that I could put the PAX logo on that observation, or on that plaza next to the observation tower, but it turned out that putting a logo inside a square that's at the end of the Mainstreet would kind of block the view that I would otherwise normally have. So in the end I decided to make the logo on the entrance building, so that's something that I'll get to in a little bit. First though, I wanted to finish this corner building, and this is kind of interesting because it's a very different style than what I have so far in the park. Or at least, I guess it still kind of fits in. It's a bit of an Art Deco, streamlined, modern building, which is a little bit more old-fashioned than what I have so far. Definitely a bit more old-fashioned than the contemporary architecture which I have in here, but it's a very quick little experimentation that I figured I might as well try, because I wanted to have a corner building which would still be interesting, but at the other hand not use too many details, and also be something that I could build relatively quickly. So I ended up going for this sort of streamlined modern style, since it's something that you can do quite quickly, it doesn't take too many details, and it was quite simple to design. Just some windows and some of those horizontal accents and the curving corners that make that type of Art Deco building so typical. So that's something I wanted to get into the corner there. Not really much else to it, just a corner building to neatly wrap up that side of the Mainstreet. And after that I wanted to do a little bit of pathworks, get an idea of what the entire path is going to look like. Also mess a little bit with like a little checkerboard pattern on the paths on the entrance. It's something that I've never really done before, but you can actually make some pretty good patterns if you like keep a very small grid on your paths. And in this case, since the entire Mainstreet is built on a grid, it's something that I could try, and I figured might as well try it and see what it looks like. And I think it looks a little bit more interesting than just keeping one single simple path texture. And it's definitely not something that I would do everywhere throughout a park, especially realistically seeing that paths inside theme parks are usually just super boring and very often just concrete, and in a game like this where all of the paths are very heavily textured and colored, they are already quite a bit fancier than inside real life theme parks, and I quite honestly wouldn't want to start making out too many patterns throughout the parks. There aren't that many amusement parks that really have colorful patterns on their pathworks. And if they do, it's either very broad patterns that you can only really distinguish on a map, or it's very small little artsy pieces. Anyway, after I did that and sort of got a general layout in, I wanted to work on the logo on the entrance of the park. And this is something that I talked about very quickly in the last episode, because we were tasked to put a logo somewhere in the park so that there is some kind of reference to PAX. And I figured, because putting the logo on like someplace in the middle of the park as a centerpiece would kind of be awkward. I also had the problem that it's nearly impossible to make a logo that like you can make out as the logo from multiple angles. And obviously if it's a centerpiece, you're gonna have to make it be able to be looked at from multiple angles, and for that reason putting it on the front of the park, just on top of the entrance as you're getting into the park, it's the only way that you can make sure that people are actually approaching it from the right angle. The other sort of thing that I was considering was making a structure that would look like a P if you look at it from one angle, would look like an A if you look at it from one angle, and would look like an X if you look at it from another angle. And while that's technically possible, and maybe someday somebody is gonna try something crazy like that, there was no way that I had time to like calculate how to even begin thinking about such a thing, so I just ended up going for the most obvious, probably the easiest, and perhaps also just the best way to go about doing it, and putting it on top of the entrance. Kind of like you would often want to have on a theme park. You're just being greeted by what the theme park is actually about. And very quickly, I also figured I could make some planters, and this is where I ran into some scaling problems. You might also notice it for the rest of the building. The in-game grid and just the in-game scaling of the walls, for instance, is a little bit iffy in a sense that it's quite large. We've got 4-meter high walls, but obviously very often I end up building buildings out of a wall plus a flat roof piece, making floors that are about 4 to 5 meters tall, and that is quite out of scale, especially when you consider that with force perspective in a theme park, in a main street, you kind of want to make the upper floors even smaller than that. So there is already kind of a scaling problem going on in the main street, in the sense that everything's a little bit too large. You only really notice it when peeps are standing right beside a building, but it's still a little bit off, and I kind of felt that with the planters that I was trying for a while as well, so I wanted to make sure that those things were at least small enough so that they wouldn't really stand out beside the guests. Now moving back again to the square, I had no planning whatsoever when I was laying out this episode, just kind of working on whatever I had some ideas for. I reckoned that I could actually just put some hedges along the side of the square. I know it's pretty boring and it's not the most imaginative thing, but the problem is that a lot of this area is just gonna end up being quite empty. For one, because I didn't have that much time to finish the park, so I couldn't really make a square surrounded by buildings like I would have done in Fantasy Valley. And also there are many empty spaces because I need the empty spaces in the park for people to build in. So I figured in the end, if I'm not going to have that much foliage around this square, it's going to end up looking like a very desolate, sort of open, agoraphobia-ish place that you don't want to have. And I figured I could at least close it a bit, make it a bit more comfortable by putting a lot of foliage on the square itself, hence the hedges and some of the foliage that I'll be filling in alongside this square with some planters and some foliage that'll sit inside of the little hedged off areas. I still just love the way that the hedges look with the grass, and the way you can actually very neatly like make some shapes alongside paths and kind of make some grassy areas that are tiled in between path areas like that. It can be very time consuming to get the shapes of the hedges in correctly. So my tip would be to build hedges within one building whenever you're doing it, so that you can save your shapes and copy paste them around, kind of like I did with these hedges. And that can definitely save you a lot of time, especially if you can make some very standard modules like a 45-degree corner hedge piece or just a straight hedge piece, and be able to glue those pre-made pieces together rather than building the entire string of hedges yourself out of individual hedge scenery items. So that's what I did with that, and here I kind of worked on doing some path elements on the side of the plaza, just taking some of the lanterns that I made earlier on and copying these things around, which is quite the handy thing if you've got them saved as a separate building, and making sure that we actually have some pretty cool custom lighting going on in that sense. And this is all really done super quickly, so it's not the most detailed thing, but I think it does give a pretty good idea on how you can actually combine some different items in game to make your own items and save those around as if they were just in-game scenery objects. Now, because the corner building was looking a little bit unfinished, I decided to add some finishing touches to it and bring it to life a little bit. So we've got some lights, and then I was looking for a good sign to put on top of the door, but almost every sign was either too big or too small, and in the end I just kind of gave up on that plan and put some planters beside the building, a small antenna spire-ish thing on the top, and that's it. And that's pretty much time to move into the next building. So this building, again, is gonna be a bit more like the styles that I've tried earlier, but again, I kind of wanted to experiment a bit. So my goal for this building was to try and make a very modern looking building that would still fit inside the main street and not make it a very cold, desolate place, but at the same time, a building in which I try to avoid using windows as much as I can. Because you might know there are no actual fitting glass windows in the game, and this is also a problem that I talked a bit about in the last episode. And so one way that I guess you could try to alleviate that problem is to just avoid having windows in your building altogether, and that's kind of what I tried to do in this building. It was a little bit inspired by some designs of malls and car dealerships in America, which, as stupid as they are, can actually look pretty decent sometimes with the lack of windows. And even worse and even more American, I guess, it was also inspired by some McDonald's designs, like having those wooden blind strips and decorations, in a sense, is kind of McDonald's-ish, even though there are some slight variations on the themes throughout the buildings, like for instance these white pillars on the side, which kind of serve to make a blank windowless wall a bit more interesting than just a blank windowless wall. They still do have some variation to them, like every pillar is a little bit thicker than the pillar beside it, so there's some interesting playfulness. It's not entirely just simple beams and patterns, but it's a very contemporary building in that sense, trying to avoid those windows as much as I can. And I didn't feel too bad about it. Like, some part of me probably died making a building that's inspired by McDonald's and malls in America, because that's probably the worst thing I've ever done. But at least it is actually, it's actually a burger joint. It's a chief beef belief, so, we shouldn't worry about it too much. I guess this is actually kind of a fitting theme, I feel, for the chief beef restaurant. At least I think it's a pretty good theme that they could go for with their brand. Anyway, I just quickly built the little thing on the bottom there, put the chief beef outside there to greet all the guests, make the main street a little bit more exciting, because, of course, stuff like that is definitely going to make your main street a bit more exciting than not having anything. And finally, I did want to put some darker stuff on the bottom floor, as though I actually did have some kind of decoration there. And I wasn't entirely sure how to approach these windows. In the end, I did use some of the in-game windows at the bottom there, just because they fit in, and making my own ones would take too many objects, too much time, and these fit anyway, so why use something else? So I quickly put in some glass on the bottom floor, but the rest of the building is staying pretty much the way it is. And I just wanted to put a white outline around it to make it look a bit more interesting than just a grey box, and kind of take the very boxiness away from it. So I'm going with a basic shape around here, just kind of around the grey box, to make it all look a little bit more interesting and like it's actually facing the front of the main street. And that more or less finishes this building. The rest of the work is really just finishing the backside of it, making sure that we actually do have some kind of mast to the building, and that eventually it can actually hook up to the large sort of backstage area which I have behind all of these buildings. But anyway, with that out of the way, I figured it was time to move into the next thing, and I think I actually copied those windows from some earlier buildings, though I'm not entirely sure anymore. But the buildings which I wanted to build here are a bit more like, I guess, American row houses, some very old ones, stuff that you would see around Chicago, but then in more of a new urbanism kind of style, so it's still using some much more modern textures and a bit more minimalistic detailing, but it's still very much the style that it's trying to emulate. In a very simple way, because I wanted to do this quite quickly, but it's also a style which I didn't have in the main street yet, so I figured I might as well try it and see how it ends up. And especially when it comes to like the frieze which I have on the top of it, or, well, it's technically just the corners. especially when it comes to the cornices, which I have on top of the building. I think that really just makes or breaks the buildings in these cases, and being able to make your own cornice pieces is something that really adds, especially to buildings like these. I've seen a few of these recently, actually, in Planet Coaster, and the ability to put all kinds of very small scenery objects together to, that was the weirdest pronunciation of together I've ever heard, but yeah, to put like all kinds of small scenery pieces together to make your own cornice pieces. I think it's parts like that on buildings like these that really make them different, and with which you can make every building unique. Like the walls themselves are just straight walls with a simple texture and some windows on it, and there's really not anything else to this building. It's the shape and the detail that the cornices bring out. That's really just about what does it for these buildings, I guess. So with those things finished, I figured it was time to move into the lighting for a little bit, because I haven't really lit up any of the main street, and this is where the area lights come back, and they are really important. I put them on a sort of very dark brown tint, which is kind of grey brownish, which is a tone of color which I really like for the lights. I think white is very bright, and you run a really great risk at overlighting your buildings, and just going for this very dark brown-esque color adds a subtle lighting to your buildings, as if they're actually being lit up by real park spotlights, but at the same time it doesn't really overlight them, and there's also a very slight warm touch to it. Like, it's not exactly white, which I was afraid would make these buildings very cold, because many of these buildings still do have some very rustic, warm colors to them. So I wanted to bring that out in the lighting as well. So that's why it's slightly brown instead of being white. Anyway, to move into the next building, this is a bit of a filler, a bit more of a classical building actually, and just with some round windows and some more classical details. All still very simple, but I think it fits in quite nicely with the townhouses on the side, which I just built earlier. So I figured I could get that in there, and it's also a pretty good opening for, what is that again? The Foxy Coffee, even though I don't think it's called that anymore, not entirely sure. But it's the coffee shop with the fox anyway, with the amazing design by SP Ridley as well, which is pretty cool. For those who didn't know, it was actually a mascot that was designed by community member SP Ridley, and there were some contests for people to draw and get their own mascots out there, and these have actually been taken into the game, which is pretty interesting stuff to know. Anyway, moving on to the next building, and this is the final building of the main street. Another main street, like modern-ish building, I figured would work out quite nicely over here, since we're close to the entrance and I wanted to get back into the more entrance style at this point. And again, I was trying to avoid having that window texture as much as I could by kind of having these detail pillars on the front here. But in the back, I did end up going with the in-game windows again, because I felt like the texture just works more or less fine. And especially some of the framework that you have on those windows works quite nicely with the textures that I had on the building so far. So I was quite happy with that. It's a very simple building, where really the only touch to it is the detailing. But I think in the end, it does work quite nicely, and I'm pretty happy with how it rounds up all of the buildings in the main street. So to conclude this episode, I wanted to do a little bit of detailing around the main street. Not too much, but still put some of those signs of life in, so some more planters, some lights around the buildings where I didn't have those yet, and basically make everything kind of look as though it's actually, you know, being lived at or being part of a theme park. And very finally get into the foliage of the plaza here, so we kind of have an idea of what that's going to look like. And that is pretty much it for today. So thank you guys for watching, and I hope to see you guys in the next episode.